Hi, this is Emma DiMaggio, Communications Manager of the Golden Rain Foundation, and you're listening to Leisure World Direct. I'm here with Executive Director Jessica Sedgwick and Executive Manager Dave Potter. Hello.
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 In our last episode, we talked about the budget process, and today we will be talking about reserve funds. To start, what are reserve funds, you guys?
Well, I think a lot of people oversimplify reserve funds to the point of getting it wrong. And what I mean by that is I hear a lot of people talk about how the reserve fund is like the piggy bank for a common interest development. And that's not exactly true, because a piggy bank is where you save money not knowing what you're going to spend it on, right? You're just putting money away for a rainy day. You don't know when the rain's going to come or what it's going to be for. A reserve fund is actually where you accrue money for very specific defined purposes. And that's what makes a common interest development unique, I think, among most businesses out there. You govern your reserve fund through something called a reserve study, where you identify all of the major components that will need to be either replaced at some point or will need to have significant repairs done. So the example I always like to use is replacing a roof or replastering a pool, right? A roof is replaced maybe every 30 years. A pool might be replastered every 10 or 15 years, depending on the life of the pool, how much gets used, et cetera, et cetera. So the reserve fund will identify and say, okay, you replastered the pool in 2017, and it's going to take you 10 years before you have to replaster it again in 2027. So they're going to do a study, and they're going to say, over the 10 years, accounting for inflation as best we can, here's what we think a replaster cost will be in 2027. And here's how much money you need to contribute every month over those 10 years to have enough money on hand in 2027 to do that replastering project. And then you accrue it. And then you have to replaster it. And that's how a reserve fund works. It's there to be spent because every penny that you put into it is accrued for a specific purpose to be spent at a specific time, so that everything stays good and functional and high level.
I like to say it's a spending fund for a specific spending plan. To put it in the simplest terms, you have a plan that you're going to spend money on, and you have a fund that you spend out of. It is not a savings account.
Who puts together the reserve study, which is the plan for the reserve funds?
So that starts with a professional called a reserve analyst. So this is a third party typically that this is what they specialize, this is what they do for their career, is they put together these spending plans. So typically it starts with your very first one that you put together is a complete, what they call a full study, initial one where they come in, they review every single thing that you have in your community, put together your component list, how long anything is supposed to last, and then how much it is anticipated to cost when it needs to be replaced. And so they put together that plan. And every year you use that same reserve analyst or different one if you switch up, but the reserve analyst, again, you give them updates on what you have spent, if you've changed anything, if you added or taken away anything on there, and then they update your plan. And every couple of years, they'll come back on for a site visit to take a look at everything. But it is all based off of a professional. They have a whole bunch of charts and data that goes into it that they use to set the spending levels based on the different items.
And when you guys say everything in the community, basically, I know you said tiles on the roofs. What all does it include? Is it truly everything?
It's everything that you would spend money on less often than once a year. Okay, so the example I would use for that is tree trimming. So generally speaking, you're going to do a tree trimming project in a common interest development every year. That doesn't mean that you trim every tree every year. It just means that you spend money on trimming trees every year. That's an operating expense because you do it at least once a year. Now, if you do a tree removal project, that you do every 3 years. You evaluate your trees and you take out dead trees. That would be a reserve expense because it happens less frequently than once a year. So you would want to put a line item into your reserve fund for that, and you would want to estimate out what that'll cost to remove trees and maybe replace them and fund it accordingly using that example I used in the beginning of, hey, every 3 years, if I'm going to spend $15,000 on tree removal and replacement, how much money do I need to accrue into the fund so that in 3 years I have $15,000?
So you guys have a long list of everything that will ever need to be upgraded, replaced, refurbished. Are those prices, obviously the items are changing if something new is added to the community, but how are the prices adjusted for inflation? I know that for a while wood cost a lot of money. Every year, are they updating the prices and determining that you need to save more?
Yes. The short answer to that is yes. They do an inflation calculation for 30 years, and they do an inflation calculation, and this is the more important one, for the year over year versus the prior reserve study. And I say that that one's more important simply because from talking with our reserve analyst this year, he made the point that if he were to assume that inflation in construction area was going out over 30 years, the reserve studies would be unworkable outside of 5-6 years into the future because you're compounding that 10% interest then consistently over all time. So what they do is they adjust it for what it really was year over year. They assume a more traditional or average approach for the 30-year forecast, but they adjust it every year because we do a best business practice here and we do reserve study updates every year. They adjust based off of reality then. So if their 30-year forecast assumed 3.5% interest, which is a fair average number to put in there, but year over year it was 10%, they'll correct that year over year for the 10%. But leave the 30-year forecast at the more average number so that they don't accidentally price everybody out of existence.
How far in the future do reserve study items go? I know you referred to 30 years, but are there projects that we'll expect to need to do further than 30 years?
Sure, and you can account for that. 30 years is kind of a standard that's there, but there's no reason that a client or an individual community can't put something in that has a 40 or 50-year lifespan. A lot of tile roofs, as opposed to shingle roofs, those are a 40-year lifespan, so those would be outside of the 30-year window that is typically used. Obviously, you still want to reserve for that because you know you're going to have to do it in 40 years, so you manually put it in, set it at 40 years, and go for that. I've worked with some communities that have things that might be on a 50 or 60-year time frame. You put it in and you start funding for it, and then you're ready in 60 years, or I should say not you, the people who are there doing it right now, but the people who will live there in 60 years now have money in the bank so that they're ready to maintain the community at that point.
Yeah, there is sometimes in the reserves, they consider them lifetime components, and so they never make it into the reserve. But typically there's been a little bit of a change too, I want to say recently, on getting those components within your reserve study, because nothing really is truly a lifetime component. You know, just look at our community here where, you know, we're 62 years old at this point. There's definitely things that are not going to continue to last that maybe weren't reserved for years ago. One of the main ones that got recently added in a few years ago was the sewer pipes. So those are always expected to be more of a lifetime component, but we know we're reaching the age, things are going to happen. You never know what's going on down underneath the soil. So we've started putting money in because we know we're going to have to be doing some work on that. And then there's also been kind of a change, you know, if we want to touch on a little bit of what happened in Florida with the tower collapse down there, the Champlain Towers. And that's kind of really driven a little bit of a need to relook at some of the best practices and relook at putting in and talking about those, before air quotes, you know, lifetime components.
When you talk about having money in the bank to pay for these projects, where does the money come from? I mean, if each year it's being saved, where does that money start?
Well, so Golden Rain Foundation is a little unique in that regard because typically the money would come from the monthly assessment. If you've listened to the budgeting podcast, you've heard me talk about how part of a budget is that you say, here's how much money we're going to contribute to the reserve fund every month. And in most common interest developments, that translates to here's how much assessments you collect in order to do that. Leisure World here does something a little different. The Golden Rain Foundation has what's called the TPUF, the Trust Property Use Fee, used to be called an amenity fee, and that is paid by new residents who are coming in. Those monies that are collected are allocated towards making that reserve contribution. So the monthly assessment that is paid by people doesn't actually go, on paper at least, to funding that reserve fund. The reserve fund is funded entirely through collection of that TPUF from the new residents.
How much is that cost?
We budgeted, I don't remember the exact number, please forgive me, but it's a little over $2.5 million as an annual contribution that goes into the reserve fund every year, at least for 2025, for the Golden Rain Foundation.
Based on the number of people that move in or are projected?
Oh, are you talking about how is the TPUF calculated?
Yeah, how is the TPUF calculated?
I misunderstood the question. That's how you know it's a live recording. So, no, the TPUF is calculated off of making an estimate, if you will, because everything, it's a forecast. It's forecasted off of making an estimate on how many people are going to purchase and live here as a result of purchasing a new unit over the course of a year. And we have data, and we make a forecast based off that data, but at the end of the day, it's a forecast. And the board then sets the TPUF level at what it thinks it is appropriate. So they look at what the market is doing. They may talk to some realtors. They may look at other communities similar to Leisure World that have a similar setup and see what they're charging. And they set it at something that they believe that the market will bear. And it's a very healthy real estate market right now. So it's being set at a level of $7,000 per resident beginning January 1, 2025.
And you said before the amount that's expected to generate for the reserve funds this coming year is?
It will generate somewhere in the neighborhood of about, I shouldn't say it will generate, I should say it is forecasted to generate about $3.6 million for the foundation. Of that, about 2.5 and change is going to be allocated to make a reserve fund contribution for the year. The remainder of that money is going to go towards the operating contingency fund to try to build that up. And if you want to learn more about that, I urge you to listen to our previous episode on the episode list where we talk about the 2025 budget.
Can you share with me some misconceptions maybe about the reserve study and reserve funds and how they're used?
Absolutely. So I think one of the big misconceptions comes into this idea that, well, if we don't spend the money out of the reserve, it's going to save us money, because if we are going to spend the money, then it's going to increase our assessments. But if you remember what Dave just said, all of our reserve funding is coming from the trust property use fee. So all of the contributions that are going into that fund are coming in from new residents. None of it is coming from your assessments. So spending the money is not affecting your assessments. And in fact, I like to kind of equate it to, kind of does the opposite of what you want to think about. If you're spending money, you think, oh, if I spend money, it's going to cost me to refill it, right? Well, when you spend money in a reserve, it's meant to be spent. It's not actually going to increase what your contribution is going to be the next year, because that item gets reset. So as soon as you have an item, we will say, what's a good example to use here?
Talk about replacing a roof.
Let's replacing a roof. So we're going to be replacing the roof in Clubhouse 4. We approved that to do. So we're going to spend all the money this year to replace Clubhouse 4. Well, next year in the reserve, it goes back to a remaining useful life of 30 years, which means we now have 30 years to make up the funds to go back into it. And it's not going to increase the contribution it needs to happen. But on the reverse side, if you're not spending the money that you saved up and you're pushing it along, that project is just going to cost you more money, because as we know, we have inflation. We've had some pretty high inflation. It's stabling out a little bit right now. but the cost is going to go up. You push it down a year or two, your cost is going to be higher. Now you do have to increase what your contribution is going to be to that fund to make up for that increase that you push off to the side because of inflation. So now it's going to cost you more money to do it. And it's just one of those things with the reserve, this idea that it's your piggy bank, you break it open, you spend it, and now it's gone. But no, someone gave a very good explanation, I think it was one of our board directors, that the reserve fund is like a pool. Every time you're replacing the water in there, right? You're dropping the level down as you're spending, but more water is coming in on top to keep it full and where it needs to be healthy. And so I think if people can think of it like that with the pool, you drain a little bit, but you're adding more in. You drain a little bit, but you're adding more in. That is how the reserve fund works.
So it's expected, I guess, with inflation, nearly any project that you do will, in 5 to 10 years' time, if you push it down the road, it will be more expensive.
Guaranteed.
Can you tell me about some of the fun reserve study projects that we'll be completing in the coming year or two?
Well, we've done quite a few projects. We've been in the works. We finished up quite a bit this year, so we're going to be going into kind of a new cycle of items that are up on the reserve study. One of the ones that is going back and forth right now between facilities and the board is about renovating the restrooms. We are looking at the restrooms Clubhouse 2, Clubhouse 4, and the administration building. These are at least 30-year-old commercial restrooms that they are working on doing renovation. The money has been set aside. It is there to be spent to renovate these restrooms. I know we get a lot of questions, especially on these. Well, can't we just clean them? We should have cleaned them better. These are commercial restrooms. They get a lot of use, a lot more use than your home restroom is going to get, but that is one of the ones they're looking on. A couple of the ones, trying to remember here what we have that's up on the reserve that will be looked at is one of the big ones. It's going to be a lot of work done in the amphitheater. So there's a lot of stuff that is up to be done in the amphitheater, painting, restrooms, some lighting in there. So that's going to be kind of a big project that's going to be coming up for the facilities committee to start looking at and to start moving forward with.
I feel like from my brief look at the reserve study, it was kind of easy to understand because it's color-coded. Can you, first of all, I just want to say that in reading through it, a lot of it was really typical sort of projects like roofs and lighting and tiles. Nothing really stood out to me as some huge, massive, exciting project, but it does seem like a lot of upkeep. Can you tell me about the color coding on it? I know that there are different levels of when the amount in your pool piggy bank is healthy or unhealthy, because you obviously are setting a new number each year. You're tracking whether you're on track for something. Can you tell us about the state of our reserve study?
So that can vary a little bit from reserve analyst to reserve analyst. And the reserve analyst is the third party that prepares the study. The analyst that we've been working with here at Golden Rain Foundation for a while, he uses a standard in that if the reserve fund is anywhere from 0 to 30%, it's at a red level, meaning you're not funded very well, and the likelihood of a special assessment to cover these types of expenses is very high. And then the next layer is yellow, and that's anywhere from, I think, 30 to 70%. And that's a decent level. And that's saying that, okay, your risk of a special assessment is now moderate. Green is, for him, from 70 to 130% funded. And that means that your risk of a special assessment is actually fairly low. It's not very likely or probable. And if you are over 130%, you get into a color blue, which is not traditional. It's not on a stoplight that I've ever seen. But that's just him signifying that, hey, you've got a lot of money. You might actually want to think about doing this thing where you try to spend it down or contribute very little to bring this percentage down. Because there is such a thing as over-collecting on your reserve fund, and that is not fair to the members because now you're collecting money that you don't need if you get to that point. That is not a problem that the Golden Rain Foundation has at the present time, but I have certainly worked with communities in my time that have achieved that level or higher, and they have been in that awkward position of how do we kind of get this back down to a reasonable level, an appropriate level.
But I will say that for the Golden Rain Foundation, we are in the green.
Yes.
Our last reserve study for 2025 brought us in at about a little over 78%. So we are sitting good in the green.
Nice. Is there anything else that you think people should understand about the reserve study, the reserve funds?
I would just reiterate something that Jessica said earlier. The reserve fund is money that's meant to be spent. The reserve fund is your friend. You should not worry about spending money out of it as long as it's needed. By the same token, just because your reserve study says, hey, you need to do this year, it is actually reasonable to look at and say, if everything is still good, if it still looks really good, it doesn't look decayed or decrepit or anything, it is okay to push it out. Understand that we're going to pay more for it, but by the same token, do you pay to replaster a pool that still the plaster has held up surprisingly well? The numbers that are there are at the end of the day an industry standard. Perhaps a better example would be to talk about a pool heater. At the end of the day, you put a useful life on it, but it's going to go out when it goes out. And maybe that'll be a little early sometimes, and that'll be irksome because you haven't fully funded its replacement yet. But by the same token, maybe it'll run for 2 or 3 years longer than you thought it would. And that's okay. So don't be afraid to spend it when it says to spend it, and you need to spend it. That's my biggest advice for any board member in any community anywhere in California.
Absolutely. 100% agree with Dave there. Yes, it's there to be spent. A lot of the reserve study, too, is a process of working with the reserve analyst as well, and why they do on-site studies every 3 years, which is required per California Civil Code to have them come on site, because they are looking at the quality, the upkeep, how it actually looks, and physically inspecting it to determine, can we push out the useful life of this item?
Awesome. Thank you. This has been Leisure World Direct.